In this video, I will explain how to calculate the marginal rate of substitution using an indifference curve. So let's consider the following indifference curve right here. On this curve, we have hot dogs consumed per week on the y-axis and burgers consumed each week on the x-axis. Now we have this indifference curve right here where every point along the curve represents a combination of hot dogs per week and burgers per week that gives a consumer the same level of satisfaction, or in economics we call it utility. So I've labeled 5 points on this line, A, B, C, D, and E. Each of these combinations of hot dogs and burgers at each of these points gives the consumer the same level of utility. Now when we have an indifference curve, we can calculate something known as the marginal rate of substitution. And that simply represents at each point on the curve, what is the rate that you're willing to give up the good on the y-axis to get one additional unit of the good on the x-axis. So to calculate that using this indifference curve, all we have to do is take the change in the y, so this triangle represents change, divided by the change in the x. And the change in the y, so if we're going from one point on the indifference curve to another point, we calculate that as the new y value minus the old y value. So let's write that down. Let's say y new, the new y value, minus y old. And then we divide that by, in the denominator we do something similar. We take the new x value, let's call it x new, and we subtract the old x value, let's call it x old. So for example, let's say we go from the point A on the indifference curve to the point B. Let's find the marginal rate of substitution. So from point A to point B, all we have to do to calculate the marginal rate of substitution is take the new y value and subtract the old y value. So at point B, our y value is 20 hot dogs per week. So we have 20 minus the old y value. Well, the old y value was at point A, and we can see that's 50 hot dogs per week. So we'll say minus 50. Then in the denominator, we have x new minus x old. So the new x value at point B, that's a value of 5, so 5 burgers per week. And then we subtract the old x value. So at point A, that x value was 2. So our old x value was 2. So if we simplify, we get 20 minus 50 is negative 30, divided by 5 minus 2 is 3. Negative 30 divided by 3 is negative 10. Now typically when we talk about the marginal rate of substitution, we use an absolute value sign to force this value to be positive, just so that it's easier to interpret. So instead of a negative 10, the absolute value of negative 10 is positive 10. So let's just take away that negative sign right there. So we'll say moving from point A to point B, the marginal rate of substitution is 10. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means as we move from point A to point B on the indifference curve, we are willing to give up 10 hot dogs to gain each additional unit of burgers. So when we did this calculation, we saw that we gave up a total of 30 hot dogs and we gained 3 additional burgers. So for each additional burger that we gained, we were willing to give up 10 hot dogs. That's the marginal rate of substitution at that point on the indifference curve. Now let's calculate the marginal rate of substitution of moving from point B to point C. So from B to C, again, we're just going to use this formula up here. So the new y value at point C, that would be 10 hot dogs per week. Then we subtract the old y value. So at point B, the old y value was 20. So we'll say 10 minus 20 divided by, in the denominator we have the new x value. So at point C, this new x value, this number of burgers is 10. So we have 10 minus the old x value. So from point B, that old x value was 5. So we'll say minus 5. So we get 10 minus 20, that's negative 10, divided by 10 minus 5, that's 5. Negative 10 divided by 5 is negative 2, but we said we'll take the absolute value of this answer, so we'll make it a positive 2. So the marginal rate of substitution going from point B to point C on this indifference curve is 2. So at this point in the indifference curve, we're willing to give up 2 hot dogs to gain 1 additional burger. Now we can use the same formula to calculate the marginal rate of substitution from going from point C to point D. So to save a little bit of time, I'll show what that answer is. So going from point C to point D on the indifference curve, we have a marginal rate of substitution of 1/2. And lastly, we can calculate the marginal rate of substitution from moving from point D to point E. So I'll go ahead and show what that is as well. So that marginal rate of substitution comes out to 1/10. So we're only willing to give up 1/10 of a hot dog to gain each additional burger on the way from point D to point E on the indifference curve. So one thing that we'll notice is that as we're moving down the indifference curve, our marginal rate of substitution is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And another way to say that is that the marginal rate of substitution, this represents the slope of the indifference curve. So the slope is getting flatter and flatter. And what that really means is that when we're at point A all the way up here and we have 50 hot dogs, we're willing to give up a lot of hot dogs just to gain one additional burger. And that's because we have a lot of hot dogs, but we don't have very many burgers. So burgers are scarce. So we're willing to give up more hot dogs just to get a few burgers. But as we move down the indifference curve, we're willing to give up fewer and fewer hot dogs because now hot dogs are becoming more scarce than burgers. So we're not willing to give up as many to gain an additional burger. So that is how you can calculate and interpret the marginal rate of substitution given an indifference curve.